You're in the middle of an argument with your partner. You repeat something they said just yesterday, word for word. They look you straight in the eye and tell you, "I never said that." And suddenly, a crack forms in your certainty. Did you mishear? Did you imagine it? Or think about a parent? You remember crying as a child, desperate for comfort and hearing, "Stop being dramatic." That didn't happen the way you think. Your body remembers the tears, but your mind starts to doubt. Maybe it really wasn't that bad. Maybe you were too sensitive. Or picture yourself at work. A colleague makes a cutting remark in front of others. Later, you call it out. They smile and say, "You're overreacting. It was just a joke." The group laughs nervously, and you feel yourself shrink. Was it a joke? Why does it feel like it wasn't? These moments have something in common. They don't just sting in the moment, they create confusion. They make you doubt what you saw, heard, or felt. They blur the line between reality and illusion. This is gaslighting. It isn't always screaming or shouting or obvious lies. More often, it's subtle. A twist of language, a denial of memory, a dismissal of feelings. It's psychological smoke. You know there's a fire, but the smoke makes you doubt your own eyes. The term gaslighting comes from a 1944 film where a husband manipulates his wife into questioning her sanity by dimming the gas lights in their house and denying that anything has changed. The lights flicker, but he swears they haven't. She starts to believe she's losing her mind. And in real life, it doesn't take long before you start to feel the same. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." In many families, this burden takes the form of gaslighting. Parents rewriting events to protect themselves, denying what happened to shield their own ego. Children grow up not only carrying the weight of the family, but also doubting their own truth. Gaslighting creates an inner division. On one side, your lived experience, what you felt in your body, what you saw with your eyes. On the other side, the version someone else insists is the truth. And when those two collide, something inside you splits. Over time, this split becomes a pattern. You learn not to trust your instincts. You learn to second-guess your memory. You learn that what you feel might be wrong. And so, instead of living inside your own reality, you start living inside someone else's version of it. The psychologist Erich Fromm wrote about the human need for rootedness, the sense that our perceptions and experiences are real and valid. Without that rootedness, we become anxious, dependent, unmoored. Gaslighting erodes that foundation. It makes you feel like a plant with shallow roots, swaying in someone else's wind. Think about how this shows up in daily life. You check your phone after a fight with your partner, scrolling through old messages just to confirm what was said. The texts are there in black and white, but somehow you still feel uncertain. You recall a childhood moment only to have your sibling or parent dismiss it. That never happened. And suddenly, your memory feels fragile. You raise a concern at work, but when it's brushed off as nothing, you begin to wonder if you imagined the tension. It's a quiet erosion, not a dramatic collapse, but a steady drip of doubt that wears away your confidence. And here's the trap. The more it happens, the more you begin to do it to yourself. Self-gaslighting. You start silencing your own voice before anyone else can. You tell yourself, maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I remembered wrong. Maybe it's me. This is why gaslighting is so dangerous. It doesn't just distort the present. It plants seeds of confusion that keep growing inside you. It makes you question not just others, but yourself. And the cost is heavy. Because when you stop trusting your own mind, you lose the anchor that keeps you steady. You become vulnerable to manipulation. You hand over control of your reality. But here's the truth. The very fact that you feel the doubt so sharply is a sign that something is wrong. Healthy relationships do not thrive on distortion. Healthy families do not depend on denial. Gaslighting is not a sign that you are weak or broken. It is a strategy others use, consciously or unconsciously, to protect themselves, to gain power, to silence what they cannot face. And the first step to breaking free is to see it clearly, to name it for what it is. So ask yourself, have you ever been made to feel like your memories are unreliable, that your feelings are too much, that your truth doesn't count? If the answer is yes, you're not imagining it. You're not crazy. You may be living in the fog of gaslighting, and that fog has roots. In the next part, we'll explore where it begins, why some families and relationships rely on it so heavily, and how those early experiences shape the way you see yourself today. Gaslighting doesn't just appear out of nowhere in adulthood. It begins much earlier, often in the very place where we are supposed to feel the safest, our families. Picture a child running to their parent, tears streaming after being hurt by a sibling. The parent sighs and says, "Oh, stop crying. It wasn't that bad." The child knows the sting of the hit, the pain of the wound, but their truth is dismissed. Or imagine a child who remembers hearing their parents fighting at night. The next morning, they ask about it, only to be told, "You must have dreamed it. We never fight." The child carries the memory in their body, the quickened heartbeat, the fear, but the spoken denial makes them question their senses. These are small moments, but they lay the groundwork for something bigger. Over time, the child learns a painful lesson. What they feel may not be trustworthy. The psychologist Alice Miller described this in The Drama of the Gifted Child. She explained how sensitive children often adapt by silencing their own perceptions to survive. When a parent cannot tolerate truth, whether because of shame, guilt, or their own unresolved trauma, the child learns to twist reality just to maintain the bond. This is the seed of gaslighting. Not the lie itself, but the demand that the child sacrifice their perception to protect the parent. Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we cannot bear to acknowledge. Many parents project that shadow onto their children. If a parent is angry but cannot admit anger, the child who notices it becomes too sensitive. If a parent is neglectful but cannot face their neglect, the child who protests becomes dramatic or difficult. And so the child becomes the container for what the parent cannot hold. They carry the denial, the distortion, the burden of rewriting reality so the parent doesn't have to. This doesn't mean all parents who gaslight are villains. Some do it intentionally, as a form of control, but many do it unconsciously, repeating the very patterns they endured themselves. Gábor Maté has written extensively about this, how parents who were once shamed or dismissed often pass on the same wound, not out of cruelty, but out of unhealed pain. Still, the effect on the child is the same. The bond is preserved, but at a cost. The child loses trust in their own reality. Think about how this plays out in school. A child complains about being bullied, but the teacher says, "You're exaggerating." Kids will be kids. The message is clear, your feelings are not valid. Or consider how siblings sometimes join in the distortion. One child insists on an event that happened, the others deny it, and suddenly the lone voice feels outnumbered, silenced, erased. By the time we reach adulthood, the fog is thick. We enter relationships already trained to doubt ourselves. That's why gaslighting in love or work feels so familiar. It's not just about the partner or the boss in front of us. It echoes the childhood voice that said, "You're imagining it." The inner mechanics are simple, yet devastating. First, the denial. That never happened. Then, the inversion. You're the problem. Finally, the confusion. Maybe I did get it wrong. Maybe it really is me. Each cycle deepens the split between what we sense and what we're told. And the more we repeat it, the more automatic it becomes. We start to preempt the gaslighting by doubting ourselves before others even have to. This is self-gaslighting. It's when you silence your own perception before anyone else can. You tell yourself you're too sensitive. You convince yourself you're overreacting. You rewrite your own reality to match what others might say. Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, spoke of the conditions of worth we internalize as children. When love depends on denying our own truth, we learn to bury authenticity. Gaslighting doesn't just distort memory. It distorts identity. We stop being who we are and start being who others need us to be. And that's the real cost of early gaslighting. It doesn't just make you doubt a single event. It reshapes your entire sense of self. You become someone whose worth is always up for debate, someone whose perception is always under suspicion. But here's the paradox. The child who adapts by silencing themselves is incredibly resilient. That very sensitivity, the ability to notice, to feel deeply, is not a flaw. It's a gift. The tragedy is that the gift was twisted into a burden. So when gaslighting appears in adulthood, it lands on soil that has already been prepared. That's why it feels so familiar, even when it's painful. That's why so many people stay in gaslighting relationships. They are not simply confused by the partner in front of them, but by the echoes of the family behind them. Think of someone who constantly checks and rechecks their memory in a relationship. They scroll through old texts, replay conversations in their head, doubt their own recall. This is not paranoia. It's the survival strategy of a child who once learned that their truth was never safe. Or picture an employee whose boss rewrites deadlines or instructions. Instead of confronting it, the employee wonders if they misunderstood. That doubt doesn't start at the office. It started long before. Gaslighting thrives in the gap between perception and denial. And once you've learned to live in that gap, it can feel impossible to climb out. But here's the good news. Awareness is the beginning of freedom. When you recognize the mechanics, when you trace them back to their origins, you begin to see the pattern for what it is. A survival strategy, not the truth of who you are. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when you start to see through the fog, how awareness changes the game, how the simple act of naming gaslighting loosens its grip, and how you can begin to reclaim the reality that was always yours. If this journey eases something inside you, stay with us. Subscribe, and each step will bring a little more clarity. Thank you. There is a moment in every story of gaslighting where the fog begins to thin. It doesn't usually come with a dramatic explosion. More often, it's quiet, subtle, a pause so small you almost miss it. Maybe you hear the familiar words, "That never happened." But this time, instead of collapsing into doubt, you notice something inside you stiffen. You think, "Wait, I was there. I felt it." Or maybe you're at work, listening as a colleague dismisses your concerns, and suddenly you catch yourself thinking, "Why do I always feel smaller after these conversations?" These are cracks in the pattern, and every crack is an opening for light to enter. Carl Jung often spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by uniting the parts of ourselves that were once divided. Gaslighting thrives on division. It splits you from your own perception, your own instincts, your own reality. But awareness begins to stitch that split back together. Awareness doesn't mean you never doubt again. It means you start to notice the mechanics. You see the denial for what it is, not as truth, but as a tactic. You recognize the inversion, not as proof of your flaws, but as an attempt to avoid responsibility. This shift is powerful because it returns the weight of reality back where it belongs. Not in their hands, in yours. Think of someone who has been told all their life that they are too too sensitive. For years, they accepted it. They apologized for their tears, laughed at their own emotions, tried to harden themselves. But one day, in therapy or through a book, they hear the phrase sensitive child described as a strength. And suddenly, the insult becomes a mirror. They realize, what I felt wasn't wrong. It was real, and it mattered. That is awareness in action, a reframing that turns what was once used against you into a source of strength. Carl Rogers believed that healing begins with unconditional positive regard, the experience of being accepted as you are. Awareness gives you the chance to extend that regard to yourself. Instead of dismissing your perceptions, you learn to welcome them. You begin to say, I believe myself, and once that begins, the gaslighter's power starts to crumble. Picture this. You're in a relationship where your partner insists you never said something. In the past, you would spiral, replaying every word, blaming yourself for misremembering. But now, you pause. You breathe. You think, I may not remember every word, but I know how I felt. And that's valid. You don't need perfect recall to trust your truth. Or imagine being told at work, you're overreacting. No one else sees a problem. Instead of folding, you hold the thought. Maybe they don't see it, but I do, and that matters. The doubt still flickers, but you no longer hand over your entire reality. This is not easy. In fact, at first, it can feel terrifying, because awareness doesn't just expose the gaslighter, it also exposes the depth of the wound. You realize how many years you've been living in someone else's story. You see how many times you've erased yourself. Verena Kast, the Jungian analyst, writes about how awareness often triggers grief. The grief of lost childhood, the grief of unlived authenticity, the grief of seeing clearly what was once hidden. Awareness is not just liberation, it is mourning. But mourning is also movement. It means you are no longer trapped in the fog. You are walking out of it, even if slowly. Think about the everyday micro moments of awareness. You pause before apologizing for something that isn't your fault. You notice the tension in your chest when someone dismisses you. You write down what was said in a conversation, not to prove them wrong, but to remind yourself that your memory matters. Each of these acts is small, but together they create leverage, because every time you notice, you weaken the pattern. Every time you pause, you reclaim a piece of yourself. And here's something crucial. Awareness doesn't require confrontation. You don't have to call someone a gaslighter to see through them. The power isn't in naming them, it's in believing yourself. Jung once said that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. Gaslighting thrives in the unconscious. It wants you to keep doubting without seeing the pattern. The moment you name it, the moment you shine light on it, the fate begins to shift. So what happens next? You start to make different choices. You begin to test reality against your own perception rather than against someone else's denial. You give yourself permission to say, I don't need them to validate it for it to be real. This is the turning point. From confusion to clarity, from silence to voice, from doubt to trust. It doesn't mean the gaslighting stops. It doesn't mean the people around you will suddenly change. But you will. And that is where freedom begins. And here's the paradox of awareness. It feels both like a gift and like a burden. Because once you begin to see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The fog doesn't fully return, but the light it lets in sometimes hurts your eyes. Take Maya again. For years, she accepted the story her partner told her, that she was forgetful, too emotional, unreliable. She bent herself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit that script. And then one evening, she hears her own words echoed back to her in therapy. I keep doubting myself. I feel like I'm always wrong. The therapist pauses, looks at her and says, "What if you're not wrong? What if you're being manipulated into doubting?" It's a moment so quiet, she almost dismisses it. But later that night, lying awake, it sinks in. The whole narrative she's been living in. Suddenly it shifts, a small fracture in the glass. And through it, she sees another possibility. I was never the problem. That thought alone doesn't dissolve the years of doubt, but it's the first brick pulled from the wall. Daniel has a similar moment. At work, he catches himself mid-thought. Why do I always walk out of these meetings feeling smaller than I walked in? He doesn't have the full answer yet. But the fact that he notices it, that he observes the shrink rather than just accepting it, that's the beginning of his awareness. And Lena. She's been journaling more, tracing her feelings instead of erasing them. One day she rereads an entry about a family holiday where she was called too sensitive for crying. For years, she agreed. But now she pauses. She feels the ache in her chest, the rawness of the memory, and she whispers to herself, "That child wasn't too sensitive. That child was hurting." These are not dramatic moments. They don't make headlines. They don't even look like much from the outside, but inside they are seismic. Because once awareness enters, the script starts to crack, and those cracks matter. Verena Kast described how awareness awakens grief. At first, it feels like loss. The loss of innocence, the loss of the story you wanted to believe, the loss of the hope that maybe they were right and you were wrong. Because if they were right, then at least there was something you could fix in yourself. But grief, as heavy as it feels, is movement. It means you are stepping out of the stillness of the fog and into motion. And in that movement, something else begins to grow. Carl Rogers spoke of unconditional positive regard, acceptance without condition. Awareness is the seed of that regard turned inward. When you catch yourself mid-apology for something you didn't do, and you pause. That's self-regard. When you write down the words someone denied, not to fight them but to affirm yourself, that's self-regard. When you notice the ache in your body and say, "Yes, I feel this," and it matters, that's self-regard. Awareness is not just noticing the gaslighter, it's noticing yourself again, and yet, this is where the terror often surfaces. Because when you start to trust your perceptions again, you also start to see the reality you've been avoiding. How deeply you were hurt. How many years were spent in confusion. How many parts of yourself you silenced just to survive. It's like turning on a light in a dark room. The light frees you, but it also shows the mess. And that's why awareness is not always comfortable. Sometimes it's lonelier than the fog, because the fog at least was familiar. The fog kept you safe in its blur. Awareness is clarity, and clarity can sting. Think about those micro moments. You pause before apologizing, and suddenly you realize how often you've lived in apology. You notice the tension in your chest when dismissed, and suddenly you recognize how many times you've carried that tension silently. You jot down words in your notebook, and suddenly you see how much rewriting of your story has been done by others. Each moment of awareness is a door opening, and doors, once opened, don't close easily. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That is the essence of gaslighting. It turns manipulation into what feels like fate. You believe you are doomed to be forgetful, oversensitive, overreactive. You call it your flaw when in reality, it's their tactic. And when the unconscious becomes conscious, when the fog begins to thin, the fate begins to unravel. So what does this look like as it deepens? Maya starts catching herself in real time. The familiar phrases come, "You're imagining it. You're overreacting." But instead of collapsing, she stiffens. She breathes. She thinks, "No, I was there. I felt it. The doubt still comes, yes, but it no longer swallows her whole. Daniel notices the physical shift. His shoulders don't slump as much. His eyes don't dart down to the floor as quickly. He begins to occupy space differently, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a steadiness he hasn't felt in years. Lena notices her voice changing. Softer, but steadier. Less desperate to convince, more anchored in her own truth. She realizes she doesn't need every person to believe her. She just needs to believe herself. And here's the miracle of awareness. Once it starts, it spreads. The same clarity that helps Maya with her partner begins to show up in her friendships. The same steadiness Daniel feels at work begins to ripple into how he carries himself at home. The same self-regard Lena practices in her journal begins to soften her conversations with her children. Awareness doesn't stay in one corner of life. It leaks, it expands, it stitches across the divides, but with it also comes grief. Grief for the years lost. Grief for the child silenced. Grief for the trust broken. That grief is real, it cannot be bypassed. But it is also proof of healing, because grief only comes when you finally allow yourself to face the truth. Awareness is not the end. It's the hinge, the point where the door swings open from fog to clarity, from confusion to trust. And every hinge creaks, every swing takes effort. So if you find yourself here, if you're just beginning to notice, just beginning to catch the cracks, don't rush yourself. Awareness doesn't demand perfection. It demands patience. You will still doubt. You will still question. The old reflexes will return, but the difference now is that you will see them for what they are. Reflexes, not truth. Conditioning, not identity. This is how the fog thins. Not in one dramatic sweep, but in dozens of small openings. A pause, a breath, a note, a whisper of self-regard. Each act weakens the pattern. Each act returns you to yourself. And slowly, piece by piece, you step back into reality, not the one someone else tried to impose, but the one you always knew deep down was yours. This is the turning point. From fog to light, from doubt to trust, from silence to voice. And it matters, because the moment you begin to believe yourself again, the gaslighter's grip loosens. Not because they change. In the next part, we'll see what it looks like to take that awareness into daily life, how to practice new ways of relating, how to set boundaries, rebuild self-trust, and carry forward small but powerful habits that make gaslighting lose its grip. Awareness is powerful, but it only takes you halfway. The real test comes when you try to live differently, when you carry your new clarity into daily life. Because gaslighting is not just an event. It's a pattern that has shaped you for years, and patterns do not dissolve overnight. They return in small ways, in conversations, in body language, in the quiet voice inside your head that whispers, "Maybe it's me." So what does it look like to practice something new? Let's walk through the lives of 3 people who are learning to step out of the fog. Maya is in her 30s, in a relationship that has often left her questioning herself. Her partner has a habit of denying past promises. "I never said I'd do that." You're imagining it. For years, Maya would spiral, desperate to prove her memory. Now she's trying something different. When it happens again, she takes a breath. Instead of arguing, she simply says, "I remember it differently." Then she lets the silence stand. The pause feels unnatural, even frightening. She wants to rush in, to defend herself, to gather proof. But she resists, and in that pause, something shifts. She realizes that she doesn't need to win the argument to hold her reality. She just needs to stop abandoning it. This is practice. Not easy, not perfect, but new. Then there's Daniel, who works in a corporate office. His boss often contradicts himself. One week, he demands speed. The next, he criticizes Daniel for being sloppy. Whenever Daniel points out the inconsistency, his boss laughs it off. "You misunderstood me." Daniel used to internalize the blame, convinced he was the problem. Now he keeps a quiet log in his notebook, not for evidence, not to confront, but to ground himself. When the boss flips the script again, Daniel checks his notes. He sees his own handwriting, the dates, the words, the contradictions, and he feels steadier. Daniel isn't changing his boss, but he is changing the script in his head. He's learning to trust his memory again. And then there's Lena, who grew up in a family where feelings were constantly denied. When she cried, she was told, "You're too emotional." When she raised concerns, she was met with, "Don't make things up." Now in her 40s, she notices how quickly she gaslights herself. When a friend cancels plans, she tells herself, "I'm probably overreacting." But lately, she's been practicing something new. When the feeling rises, she places a hand on her chest and says quietly, "It's okay to feel what I feel." She doesn't have to analyze it. She doesn't have to justify it. She just allows it. Carl Rogers called this unconditional positive regard, the act of accepting someone as they are, without condition. Lena is finally learning to offer that regard to herself. These are small practices: a pause instead of an argument, a notebook instead of spirals, a hand on the chest instead of dismissal. Small but powerful, because they chip away at the old pattern and lay down a new one. But let's be honest, it doesn't always work smoothly. Maya sometimes still falls back into defending herself, scrolling through texts at 2 a.m. Daniel sometimes still leaves meetings full of self-doubt despite his notes. Lena sometimes still silences her feelings before she catches it. That's the reality of practice. It's uneven. It's fragile. It doesn't erase years of gaslighting overnight, and yet each stumble is also part of the process. Because every time they notice, even after the fact, they are strengthening awareness. They are making the unconscious conscious. Verena Kest wrote about the importance of repetition in change. Old patterns repeat until new ones are strong enough to take their place. That's why these daily practices matter. They may seem small, but they accumulate. They grow roots. And what does better look like in realistic terms? Not perfection, not constant confidence, but a gradual shift, a steadier center, a quicker recovery when doubt creeps in. Maya begins to notice that her partner's denials no longer send her spiraling for hours. She still feels the sting, but she returns to herself more quickly. Daniel finds that his log not only steadies him, but helps him see patterns in his boss's behavior. He realizes, it was never about me. Lena notices that when she validates her feelings, her friendships feel easier, less full of tension. She doesn't need others to confirm her reality as much as before. These are not grand transformations. They are subtle, lived shifts, and they matter. Because gaslighting thrives on silence, on doubt, on abandonment of the self. Every act of trust, no matter how small, is resistance. Every pause, every note, every gentle self-regard is a step back into clarity. This is how practice becomes change. Not by erasing the fog all at once, but by learning to navigate through it. By remembering that you have a compass inside you, even when others try to turn you around. So if you're practicing this in your own life, remember, the goal is not to never doubt again. The goal is to learn how to come back to yourself when doubt appears. To know that your reality matters, even when others deny it. And with time, with patience, with repetition, that knowledge grows stronger than the fog. But practice isn't just about the small acts in private. It's also about how we learn to carry them into the messy, unpredictable flow of life with others. take Maya again. She's been practicing that pause, reminding herself she doesn't have to prove her reality. But then comes a family dinner. Her partner makes a comment, denying something in front of everyone. The air gets tense. People shift in their chairs, and Maya feels the old panic flood back. The urge to argue, to grab her phone, to prove she's not crazy. This time, she steadies her breath. She remembers what she practiced. And instead of fighting, she says calmly, "I remember it differently." Then she falls silent. Her hands tremble under the table. The silence feels unbearable. But then she notices something. The conversation moves on. Her partner shrugs. People keep eating, and no one pushes her further. She didn't collapse. She didn't spiral. She stayed with herself. It's a small victory. But for Maya, it's a revolution. Because every time she does this, she sends her nervous system a new message. I don't have to abandon myself to stay safe. Daniel faces his own test. The notebook steadies him. Yes, but one day, his boss contradicts himself in front of the whole team. Daniel feels the familiar sting, the pull to doubt himself. But this time, something different happens. He doesn't argue. He doesn't retreat. He simply nods, then opens his notebook on the desk in front of him. His boss notices. His eyes flicker toward the notes. For the first time, Daniel feels the power of holding his truth, even silently. He doesn't need to expose the contradictions out loud to feel grounded. Just knowing he has his record keeps him upright in his chair. The meeting moves on, and Daniel doesn't collapse into hours of rumination afterward. He walks out with his shoulders a little higher. And Lena. She's been practicing that hand on her chest, that quiet permission to feel what she feels. But then a close friend cancels on her last minute. The old wound flares, the voice in her head that says, "You're too needy. You're overreacting. Don't make a big deal." She notices it. She pauses. And she says to herself, it's okay to feel hurt. Not explosive, not dramatic, just honest. When she sees her friend next, instead of pretending everything is fine, she says softly, "I felt disappointed when you canceled." My time matters too. Her friend blinks, surprised. For a moment, Lena braces for the dismissal she grew up with. But instead, her friend nods. "You're right. I should have told you earlier. I'm sorry." The ground doesn't collapse beneath her. The friendship doesn't end. In fact, it feels steadier. This is what practice looks like when it leaves the safety of solitude and meets the friction of the real world. It's shaky, it's terrifying, but it's also where new life begins. Because here's the truth, gaslighting doesn't just distort your reality, it trains you to abandon yourself before anyone else has to. Practice is the way back. Carl Rogers spoke of congruence. The alignment between what you feel inside and what you express outside. Gaslighting creates incongruence. You feel one thing but say another. You see one thing but deny it. You live one truth but perform another. Every small act of practice restores congruence. It closes the gap. And as that gap closes, something surprising happens. Your body begins to relax. The constant tension of self-doubt softens. The anxiety that once filled your chest eases, even slightly. Because self-trust is not just a thought, it's a physical state. Verena Kast wrote about the power of repetition in rewiring old wounds. Each act of practice, Maya's pause, Daniel's notes, Lena's self-regard, is like laying a single brick. Alone, one brick doesn't build much. But over time, the wall grows, the fog lifts, a structure takes shape, the steady architecture of trust. And yet, let's be honest, some days it collapses. Maya sometimes explodes, arguing late into the night. Daniel sometimes doubts his own handwriting. Lena sometimes dismisses her feelings before she can catch herself. These aren't failures. They are part of the process. Because gaslighting is not undone by a single moment of clarity. It is undone by persistence, by coming back again and again to the same practice, even after slipping. Think about it like learning to walk after an injury. At first, every step feels fragile, unsteady, painful. You fall, you limp, you doubt you'll ever move freely again. But each attempt strengthens the muscles, retrains the balance, restores the rhythm. Healing is not linear, it's cyclical. So what does better really look like? For Maya, better looks like noticing she recovers faster. The arguments that once consumed entire days now fade after an hour. She feels the sting, but she doesn't spiral. She can hold her truth without turning it into a war. For Daniel, better looks like walking into meetings with less dread. The notebook isn't just a record. It's a lifeline. It reminds him that his mind is reliable, that his memory holds, that he isn't the problem. For Lena, better looks like sharing her feelings without bracing for dismissal. Not every time, not perfectly, but more often than before. And each time she does, the friendships that matter grow deeper, steadier, more real. These shifts are subtle. They don't announce themselves with fanfare, but they are profound, because they mark the slow return of self-trust. Gaslighting thrives on silence, on self-abandonment, on doubt that multiplies in the shadows. Every small act of practice, every pause, every note, every moment of self-regard is an act of rebellion, a reclaiming of what was stolen. And here's the paradox. The more you practice, the more you realize the goal was never to erase doubt entirely. The goal is to recognize doubt when it comes, to meet it with clarity, and to return to yourself. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. Gaslighting pulls you away from that path, scattering you into fragments. Practice is how you gather those fragments back. Not all at once, not perfectly, but piece by piece. So if you are in the middle of this journey, if you are learning to trust yourself again, remember this: it will feel shaky, it will feel slow. Some days, it will feel impossible. But every time you notice, every time you pause, every time you honor your reality, you're building something stronger than doubt. A life where your perception matters, where your feelings are valid, where your story is your own again. This is how the fog begins to lift. This is how practice becomes change. In the next part, we'll bring everything together. We'll explore what it means to integrate these insights, to reclaim your reality fully, and to step forward not as someone endlessly distorted, but as someone grounded, whole, and enough. You've felt how gaslighting creeps into conversations, how it twists memory, how it makes you doubt your own feelings. You've traced its roots back to childhood, where parents, siblings, teachers, even entire families built survival on denial. You've seen how awareness cracks the pattern, how small practices begin to anchor you again. And now comes the work of integration. Integration means stitching the split back together. The split between what you feel and what you're told. The split between your memory and their denial. The split between who you are and who you've been told to be. Carl Jung wrote that individuation is the lifelong journey of becoming whole. Gaslighting attacks the very heart of that journey. It teaches you to fragment, to discard parts of yourself, to believe that reality belongs to someone else. But individuation calls you back. It whispers, your truth is not negotiable, your perception is not disposable, your life belongs to you. Think of it like this. For years, gaslighting made you believe that the mirror was broken, that your reflection was distorted, unreliable, but the mirror was never broken. The distortion came from the hands that insisted you see it their way. Integration is learning to stand before that mirror and say, I trust what I see. This doesn't mean you'll never face doubt again. Doubt is part of being human, but now you can hold it differently. Instead of collapsing under it, you can pause, you can breathe, you can remember, my reality matters. Consider Maya, Daniel, and Lena again. Their lives are not suddenly free of gaslighting, but they are freer within themselves. Maya no longer spends endless nights trying to prove her memory. Daniel no longer accepts his boss's contradictions as evidence of his own failure. Lena no longer silences her feelings before they can speak. Each of them is reclaiming small pieces of reality, and those pieces add up. This is the essence of integration. Not perfection, but wholeness. A life where you no longer abandon yourself to survive. A life where you can stand in the fog and still trust your compass. Carl Rogers said that healing begins the moment we offer ourselves unconditional positive regard. That's what integration looks like. Giving yourself the acceptance you were denied. Trusting your memory. Trusting your feelings. Trusting your truth. And from there, something new becomes possible. Relationships that aren't built on distortion, but on honesty. Work environments where you know the difference between responsibility and blame. Friendships where your feelings are not dismissed but respected. This is not just about breaking free from gaslighting. It's about reclaiming the right to live in your own story, to no longer be a character in someone else's narrative, but the author of your own. And here's the most important thing to carry forward. You're not crazy, you're not too sensitive, you're not broken. The very fact that you have felt the dissonance so sharply means you were never fully lost in the fog. Some part of you always knew. Some part of you always resisted. And that part is still here, waiting to grow. So take this with you. The next time someone tries to rewrite your reality, pause. Remember that your perception is valid, your feelings are real, your memory matters. You do not need their permission to trust yourself. This is how the fog lifts. Not all at once, not forever, but moment by moment, breath by breath, choice by choice. And as you practice, as you integrate, as you reclaim your reality, you will find something that gaslighting could never destroy. The quiet, steady truth of who you are. This is the beginning of freedom. In the next video of this series, we'll go deeper into the origins of gaslighting in families, how denial, projection, and silence shape entire childhoods, and why so many adults carry those patterns forward. Because to truly break free, we need to understand not just the fog itself, but where it comes from.